3 unmanned surface vessels, 280 kilometers of open Black Sea water, 1 sanctioned crude carrier moving oil under a falsified flag that was never supposed to move. What happened when those 3 facts collided is a case study in how Ukraine is rewriting naval warfare without a single conventional warship in the fight. I'm your host at UkraineRadar, where we analyze the battles that change wars. Tonight, we're breaking down one of the most technically ambitious naval strikes of the entire conflict. A deep-water intercept against a Shadow Fleet tanker, planned over weeks, executed in darkness, visible from the shoreline as a fireball that climbed 300 meters into the night sky. This is not a story about luck. It's a story about what happens when a nation with no functioning surface navy decides to build one from scratch. Composite hulls, commercial GPS, and tactical thinking that military academies will be picking apart for decades. The vessel had been operating for months in what Russian logistics planners believed was a perfectly invisible corridor. Ship-to-ship transfers off the Caucasus coastline. Cargo moving between sanctioned hulls and fresh-flagged intermediaries in international waters beyond easy surveillance. The scheme was simple. Load crude from a Russian port, sail to a transfer point, pump cargo to a vessel with cleaner paperwork, let that second ship deliver to buyers in South Asia and the Gulf who were content not to ask questions. Russian planners had been running variations of this system since the early phases of the full-scale war. The Shadow Fleet had grown into a logistics organism with dozens of vessels, rotating flag registrations, falsified manifests, and AIS transponders that went dark at convenient moments. By the time Ukrainian intelligence had identified the specific tanker at the center of this operation, it had completed at least 9 such transfers without incident. Russian naval escorts occasionally shadowed the transfer zones. Patrol boats made irregular sweeps. But the open sea is vast, surveillance is expensive, and Moscow had convinced itself that the distances involved made a Ukrainian strike effectively impossible. That calculation was about to become catastrophically wrong. The MAGURA-V5 unmanned surface vessel entered operational service with Ukrainian naval forces in the early phases of the full-scale conflict. By the time of this operation, an evolved variant was in the field. Composite hull, low radar cross-section, twin electric motors supplemented by a diesel unit for extended range. Operational radius pushing past 800 kilometers under optimal sea state conditions. Payload capacity sufficient for a shaped explosive charge designed to rupture below waterline hull sections in the pump station region of a tanker's midship structure. Each drone weighed approximately 1,000 kilograms fully loaded. Thermal signature minimal. Acoustic signature at cruise speed low enough to be confused with wave noise beyond 2 kilometers. They navigated via satellite uplink with an encrypted command channel, letting operators override autonomous targeting from a shore station. In the final terminal phase, they switched to optical lock, a camera and AI-assisted targeting system guiding each unit onto the precise hull section that would cause maximum structural damage. 3 of these systems were tasked for this operation. Not because 3 were required to sink the target. 3 were assigned because Ukrainian planners had studied previous operations carefully and knew at least 1 drone had a meaningful probability of being detected and engaged before reaching strike distance. 2 were considered the minimum for a guaranteed effect on a vessel of this tonnage. 3 gave the operation a comfortable margin. Which weapon was ultimately deadlier in this operation? The autonomous navigation system that got the drones to their target, the explosive payload that ruptured the hull, or the intelligence architecture that identified the vessel in the first place? Comment below with your analysis, because the answer is more complicated than it looks. The operation traces back to satellite imagery analysis conducted over roughly 6 weeks. A European commercial satellite provider whose imagery was being monitored by Ukrainian defense intelligence analysts captured what initially appeared to be a routine anchorage. 2 vessels sitting close together, stationary, in international waters roughly 40 kilometers off the Caucasus coast. The kind of image that might be dismissed as fishing activity or a mechanical breakdown. An analyst with experience in Shadow Fleet tracking noticed the specific geometry. Bow-to-bow positioning with fenders deployed. The telltale configuration of a ship-to-ship transfer in progress. Cross-referencing the imagery timestamp against AIS data showed both vessels had gone dark in the preceding 12 hours. One had last pinged its transponder near a Russian Black Sea port. The other had last been seen in a Turkish Strait transit weeks earlier, heading into the Black Sea under a flag of convenience tracing back to a shell company in a jurisdiction with minimal maritime oversight. Stay with me, because what the analysts found when they started pulling the thread on that second vessel's ownership structure is what made this entire operation possible. The tanker designated for the strike had a documented history of carrying cargo for entities that had subsequently appeared on Western sanctions lists. The vessel itself had not yet been formally designated, which meant it was operating in a gray zone of legal ambiguity that Russian logistics planners had been carefully cultivating. By keeping the vessel just outside the formal sanction perimeter, Moscow maintained plausible deniability about its role in sanctions evasion. The ship's captain filed legitimate-seeming paperwork. Cargo was listed under generic commodity codes. The buyers at the receiving end were separated from the origin by enough transactional layers to make direct legal action difficult. Ukrainian intelligence shared this analysis package with Western partner agencies. The response confirmed what Kyiv already suspected. The vessel was a key node in a logistics chain generating hundreds of millions in revenue for the Russian state, revenue flowing directly into military production. Shells. Drones. The salaries of soldiers being pushed into Ukrainian territory. Every cargo transfer this tanker completed was, in a direct sense, financing the war-killing Ukrainian civilians. The decision to strike was not taken lightly. Naval drone operations in the Black Sea carried real risk. Russian air defenses in the region had been improved following earlier Ukrainian maritime strikes. Patrol vessels operated irregular schedules specifically designed to complicate Ukrainian planning. Electronic warfare systems on the Crimean coast and aboard some Russian surface combatants could disrupt drone navigation in certain frequency bands. And the transfer zone was far enough from Ukrainian-controlled coastline that the operation would require the drones to transit a corridor running close to areas where Russian surveillance assets were known to operate. How many individual systems did Ukraine use in this strike package when you factor in support elements? Not just the strike drones themselves? Option A, 3. Option B, 7. Option C, 11 or more. Hold that question. The answer comes at the end of this breakdown, and it will probably change how you think about what a drone strike actually involves. The planning phase lasted 3 weeks. Ukrainian Naval Special Operations personnel reviewed satellite imagery on a near-daily basis, tracking the tanker's movement pattern, identifying its preferred anchorage zones, cataloging the timing of Russian patrol vessel movements in the broader area. Weather analysis was integrated into the planning cycle. The Black Sea in this season ran a consistent pattern of calm windows between low-pressure systems moving through the region, and Ukrainian planners wanted a strike window with minimal wave height to maximize drone stability in the terminal approach phase. The shore control station was positioned at a classified location on Ukrainian-controlled coastline. Operators monitored both the drone telemetry feeds and a separate intelligence feed pulling real-time data from partner assets tracking Russian patrol vessel positions. The communication architecture had been hardened against jamming attempts following earlier operations where Russian electronic warfare had attempted to disrupt drone command links. The system now incorporated frequency hopping protocols and redundant satellite uplink pathways. 48 hours before the planned strike window, a problem emerged. Russian naval activity in the western sector of the planned approach corridor spiked unexpectedly. A patrol vessel that had been operating on a predictable schedule suddenly changed its pattern, conducting extended sweeps that brought it within detection range of the corridor Ukrainian planners had designated as the primary approach route. Simultaneously, a reconnaissance aircraft was detected operating in the broader region, suggesting Russian intelligence may have developed some awareness of increased Ukrainian naval activity, even if the specific operation remained undetected. Ukrainian commanders faced a choice: abort and reset, potentially losing the transfer window they had been tracking for weeks, or adapt the approach route and accept a longer transit time that would push the strike into a less favorable weather window. They chose a third option. They waited. 41 hours. The patrol vessel eventually returned to its standard pattern. The reconnaissance aircraft completed its tasking cycle and departed the region. When a narrow window opened in the corridor, Ukrainian operators pushed the execute command. The 3 MAGURA variants entered the water at night, electric motors running at reduced power output to minimize acoustic signature in the departure phase. Operators at the shore control station tracked each unit through its telemetry feed as the drones moved away from the coast and into open water. For the first 2 hours, the transit was unremarkable. The Black Sea surface was running a half-meter swell, within the operational parameters the planners had designated as acceptable. The drones maintained their designated spacing interval, approximately 800 meters between units, close enough for coordinated terminal attack sequencing, but spread enough that a single detection event would not automatically compromise all three. At the 4-hour mark, an obstacle emerged that had not been in the pre-mission intelligence picture. Subscribe to UkraineRadar if you want to understand how modern warfare actually works, because what I'm about to describe is a perfect example of why real operations never go exactly according to the plan that looked perfect in the briefing room. A commercial fishing vessel, operating at night with minimal lighting, had positioned itself almost directly across the primary approach corridor. Not a Russian asset, not a surveillance platform. Just a fishing boat doing what fishing boats do, sitting in international waters with its nets deployed, completely unaware that 3 autonomous naval drones were approaching its position in the dark. The drone operators faced an immediate problem. The autonomous navigation systems were programmed to avoid contact with any surface vessel detected in their path. Collision with the fishing boat meant mission failure, potential loss of all 3 drones, and the possibility that wreckage carrying identifiable Ukrainian military components would be found by Russian salvage operations before the story could be told on Ukrainian terms. The operators executed a manual override, taking direct control of all 3 units and steering them around the fishing vessel in a wide arc that added approximately 40 minutes to the transit time and pushed the approach angle into a slightly less favorable attack geometry. The drones executed the maneuver without incident. The fishing boat's crew never knew what passed within 3 kilometers of their hull in the darkness. Think about that for a moment. You're sitting at a shore control station, watching your 3 drones thread around an obstacle nobody predicted. What would you have done? Comment your answer, because this kind of split-second decision is exactly the difference between an operation that succeeds and one that becomes a cautionary briefing at a naval academy. By the time the 3 drones completed their approach arc and re-established their designated attack corridor, the tanker had completed the bulk of its transfer operation. The second vessel in the transfer pair had separated and was moving away to the south. The target tanker was holding position, completing final pump-down operations before it would depart for its next waypoint. From a targeting perspective, this was favorable. A stationary target is significantly easier to engage than one making way. The drone operators confirmed target lock through the optical systems and authorized the transition to terminal attack mode. The sequence that followed lasted 11 minutes and 43 seconds from the moment the first drone switched to terminal optical guidance to the moment the last explosive detonation was recorded. The first MAGURA came in from the target's starboard quarter, approaching the midship section at a bearing that placed it on a course for the pump manifold assembly located at approximately the vessel's center of buoyancy. The tanker's crew had some detection capability. Russian patrol vessels in the region were equipped with radar systems theoretically capable of tracking small surface contacts. The tanker itself had standard commercial maritime radar. But a composite-hull drone running at wave-top height in a half-meter swell presents a radar cross-section that is difficult to distinguish from wave clutter, particularly at night, and particularly when the crew is occupied with the final stages of a cargo transfer and not expecting to be in a threat environment. The first drone closed to within 400 meters before triggering an alarm on the tanker's bridge. 400 meters is not enough warning. At attack speed, the drone covered that distance in approximately 18 seconds. The crew had time to shout. They had time to begin reaching for communication equipment. They did not have time to initiate any meaningful countermeasure. The first detonation hit below the waterline at the portside pump station. The shaped charge was specifically optimized to defeat double hull construction by focusing blast energy inward through the outer hull shell and the void space between the double skins. The explosion created a breach approximately 2 meters wide in the outer hull and roughly 70 centimeters in the inner hull above the waterline in the cargo tank section. A crude carrier's pump station is the mechanical heart of the vessel. It is where the pipework that moves cargo between tanks and between vessel and shore concentrates. A rupture at the pump manifold does not simply create a hole. It creates a cascade failure. High-pressure pipework fails. Cargo begins to flow uncontrolled. And crude oil, under pressure in a warm tank, becomes an atomized vapor cloud at the point of rupture. The second drone arrived 47 seconds after the first. Its target was the vessel's stern section, specifically the area above the engine room. The intent was not to destroy the propulsion system. That was secondary. The intent was to ensure the vessel could not maneuver away from its position, could not make way, could not attempt to beach itself anywhere that would allow cargo salvage or meaningful damage control. The second detonation penetrated the afterdeck plating and sent fragmentation through the engine room ventilation intake ducting. The main engine sustained damage from secondary effects. The vessel's emergency generator remained operational, which is why the distress signal was transmitted almost immediately. The third drone was 17 seconds behind the second. By the time the third unit reached attack geometry, the tanker was already listing slightly to port from flooding through the hull breach created by the first strike. Vapor from the ruptured cargo pipework was collecting in the midship area. The crew had activated fire suppression systems, but suppressant systems designed for a contained engine room fire are not engineered for an open deck vapor cloud of this volume. The third drone detonated at the waterline on the starboard side, amidships, approximately 4 meters forward of the original breach. The ignition that followed was what was visible from the shoreline. Crude oil vapor clouds, when ignited, do not create contained fires. They create instantaneous pressure waves that expand outward and upward faster than any suppression system can respond to. The initial fireball rose an estimated 300 meters. The secondary combustion of the cargo flowing out of the breached tank sections fed a sustained fire that burned for hours. Satellite imagery captured the thermal signature at intervals throughout the following day. OSINT analysts tracking the event noted the size of the burn was consistent with a significant cargo release. Ukrainian sources estimated the tanker was carrying between 60 and 80,000 metric tons of crude when the strike occurred. Not all of that cargo burned, but a significant fraction did, or was released into the sea in the immediate aftermath. The Russian response in the hours following the strike followed a now familiar pattern: initial denial, then confusion, then official silence while the information ecosystem tried to establish what narrative was tenable. The tanker's distress signal had been received. The location was in international waters, the vessel's flag state, a jurisdiction with minimal maritime enforcement capacity, was technically responsible for coordinating the response, but had neither the assets nor the political inclination to pursue the matter vigorously. Russian maritime authorities issued statements describing an incident involving an unnamed vessel. The word attack did not appear in initial official Russian communications. If you believe tactics win wars, type UkraineRadar in the comments. Because what this operation demonstrates is that tactical innovation, applied consistently and at scale, forces strategic adaptation even from a much larger adversary. Intercepted communications recovered and subsequently released through Ukrainian intelligence channels showed that the immediate aftermath of the strike generated significant alarm within Russian naval logistics circles. Not specifically because of the loss of this single vessel, though losing a key node in the Shadow Fleet transfer network was a real disruption, but because the operation demonstrated a capability gap that Russian planners had been treating as a comfortable margin of safety. The transit distance: 280 kilometers of open water. Prior to this operation, Russian naval planners working in the Black Sea theater had maintained an internal assessment that Ukrainian naval drone range was likely to fall somewhere between 150 and 200 kilometers for effective operational use, accounting for the need to maintain reliable command link integrity and retain sufficient payload mass for a meaningful strike. Operations at greater distances were considered theoretical, not proven. This operation proved them wrong by 80 kilometers. And in military planning, 80 kilometers of margin is not a rounding error. It is a fundamental revaluation of threat geometry. Every asset that Russian planners had positioned with the previous range estimate in mind was now potentially inside the threat envelope. Transfer zones that had been considered safe by virtue of their distance from Ukrainian-controlled coast were no longer safe. Patrol schedules calibrated to intercept threats approaching from directions the old range estimate made logical were now potentially configured against the wrong threat axis. The Shadow Fleet's entire operating geometry in the Black Sea had to be reconsidered. Reconsidering it meant disruption. Vessels that had been operating on predictable schedules began shifting their patterns, which introduced inefficiency into the logistics chain. Transfer zones moved further from Ukrainian coastline, meaning longer transits for the vessels involved, higher fuel costs, and more exposure to other forms of surveillance and interdiction. The cascade effect of a single successful strike, executed at the edge of known operational capability, rippled through Russian logistics planning in ways that a conventional strike on a fixed shore installation could not have replicated. What would NATO have done differently in planning this operation? Comment your analysis, because there is a genuine doctrinal question embedded here about the relationship between platform capability and operational ambition. Ukraine doesn't just use weapons. Ukraine invents new ways to fight. The evolution of the MAGURA program from its early deployments to this operation represents exactly that kind of progression. Each earlier operation taught something. Each lesson was incorporated: the composite hull that reduced radar signature, the electric motor suite that reduced acoustic signature, the frequency-hopping command architecture that hardened the link against jamming, the optical terminal guidance system that allowed autonomous lock acquisition independent of GPS signal integrity in the final approach phase. None of these capabilities appeared fully formed. They evolved through contact with a real adversary that was actively trying to defeat them. The Russian Black Sea Fleet, reduced from its pre-war composition by the losses it had absorbed over the course of the conflict, was no longer capable of providing the kind of aggressive surface presence that might have made this operation more difficult. The loss of the flagship and other major surface combatants to earlier Ukrainian strikes, the Moskva being the most prominent among them, had effectively driven Russian surface combatants out of the western Black Sea and into a defensive posture closer to their home ports. This retreat had removed the most capable anti-surface warfare assets from the area of operations relevant to the Shadow Fleet transfer zones. What remained were patrol vessels and coastal defense assets, capable of deterring small incursion attempts. Not capable, as this operation demonstrated, of providing reliable coverage across the full threat envelope that Ukrainian naval drone forces could now credibly threaten. The operation had one more dimension that Ukrainian planners had considered carefully. The choice to strike a Shadow Fleet logistics vessel rather than a military combatant was deliberate. A strike on a Russian naval vessel carries clear military targeting justification, but also generates political friction with states that had been quietly hoping the naval dimension of the conflict would remain contained. A strike on a vessel engaged in sanctions evasion to fund the Russian war machine sits in a different category. One where the case for interdiction is stronger, the sympathy for the target is minimal, and the message to other Shadow Fleet operators is clear. Every crude carrier captain who heard about this strike had to make a calculation. Was the fee for carrying Russian sanctioned cargo sufficient compensation for the risk that a composite-hulled drone might be approaching in the dark? Some would still take the risk, but the risk premium had just increased substantially. The economics of Shadow Fleet participation had shifted. The Black Sea is quieter now in the waters where the tanker burned, but satellite imagery shows the debris field. Ukrainian naval forces hold a capability that Russian planners have to account for every time a logistics vessel enters the Black Sea or operates in the broader threat envelope. That is a strategic effect created without a single conventional warship, without a naval pilot, and without the support infrastructure that traditional naval power projection requires. Now, the answer to the quiz from earlier. How many individual systems did Ukraine employ in this strike package when you factor in support elements beyond the 3 strike drones? The answer is option C, 11 or more. Here is why. The 3 MAGURA strike drones are the obvious components. But the complete operational package included satellite imagery analysis from at least 2 separate commercial satellite providers whose data was being processed by Ukrainian intelligence. It included signals intelligence assets, tracking Russian patrol vessel schedules, and providing real-time location data to the shore control team. It included at least 2 separate command link satellite uplink pathways to ensure redundancy against jamming attempts. It included weather analysis feeds being processed to confirm the operational window. And it included partner intelligence coordination with Western agencies who had confirmed the targeting package. When Ukrainian commanders say the shot is 11 systems rather than 3, they mean it. Modern maritime strike is a networked operation. The drone that hits the target is the tip of a very deep stack of enabling capabilities, each of which had to function correctly for the strike to succeed. That is why Ukraine's continued investment in the intelligence architecture and the communications infrastructure matters as much as the drone production rate itself. Was striking a Shadow Fleet logistics vessel the right tactical choice, or should Ukrainian resources have been allocated against higher-value Russian military targets? Could Russian naval logistics planners have prevented this strike with different patrol scheduling and coverage geometry? And what would you have done if you were the drone operator who had to manually steer 3 systems around an unexpected fishing boat at midnight with the clock running and the attack window narrowing? These are the questions that matter. These are the decisions that define outcomes in a war where innovation is the decisive factor. Will Ukrainian naval drone technology force a complete rethinking of Black Sea maritime operations over the next 2 years? Comment yes or no, because the trajectory from this operation forward is one of the most significant unanswered questions in the naval dimension of this conflict. Subscribe to UkraineRadar, because we break down the battles that textbooks will study for decades. Real tactics, real consequences. UkraineRadar. The sea is quiet in the hours after an operation like this, but the manifold pressure gauges on that tanker are frozen at 0. The pump station is flooded. The cargo that was funding a war has burned or sunk. And somewhere in a Russian naval logistics planning cell, someone is looking at a map trying to figure out where the next threat might come from. The answer is everywhere they thought was safe. Stay vigilant.